Welcome to Joy on Paper Live. My name is BRIA Burton, and I'm the guest host today for Patsy. And I will be interviewing an author named ALLEN Arnold. ALLEN, welcome to Joy on Paper Live.
Thanks, Priya. It's so good to be with you guys today.
It is so awesome to have you here and to be able to talk about your book, Risk the Real. And normally, I am often interviewing authors to talk about science fiction. So a lot of people have been able to listen to some of my interviews with authors like Lou Diamond Phillips and Veronica Roth and Jeffrey Carver, talking about just far off fantastical places. What's so great about talking to you, Arnold, is we're getting a little bit homebound for today, but not totally. Not totally. This is nonfiction, but it ties into a lot of the reasons why people write science fiction. What you're writing here speaks so much to our current day and what is going on in current day technologies, what's going on in current day sociologically, and as sci-fi writers, some of the best science fiction taps into psychological issues. What happens when you have a society that takes a path down this route, and what does society? So there's just some really rich and deep things I think we're going to be able to hit on. And let's start with one of the notes from your book. Everyone has a North Star. So that's a quote directly from the book Risk the Real. And the subheading is How to Defy the Rise of the Artificial. So we're talking about a North Star, and right there on your cover, you've got this wonderful, bright, shining star. So we're already kind of hanging out with the science nerds, right? Because we're talking about stars. So can you just talk a little bit about where that where that ties into what you've written? Even like, do people even know what the North Star is? I mean, let's talk about that. What is the North Star?
Yeah, totally. And I love that you showed the cover to begin with
Mhm.
because if people look at the cover, there is a North Star in the middle of the cover, but there are artificial stars above it and around it. And I think so much
Correct.
of what we're trying to do in this conversation is talk about, yes, what is the true North Star, but what are all the bright, shiny things, the fake stars, the fake um, objects that lure us away from the North Star. And so that was what the cover was doing. And when we talk about the North Star, I'm going to quote something from an article called Meet Polaris, the North Star. And it says, if you were to stand at the North Pole, Polaris would be directly overhead at the zenith. And it talks about how it stands in the same spot all night long while the rest of the sky appears to rotate around it. The North Star is therefore a dependable constant in a sky that is always in motion.
Mm.
No other astronomical object maintains the same apparent position at all times. This fact has proven extremely helpful to human travelers for centuries because if you find Polaris in the north, you instantly know all four directions around you. So
Yeah.
the North Star is this anchoring device for us that we can look to say, what is the one thing, no matter how crazy the world gets, no matter how chaotic the world gets, that we can look to that anchors us, reminds us where home is, what center is, what matters most. And the thing is, Bria, like most people, when you ask them this, they at
Mhm.
first would say, "Oh, yeah, my North Star is God or it's, family." But the best way to look at what your North Star is where do you spend the most time and place your greatest identity? And so in the book, I give like, gosh, 20, 25 different things that could all be our North Star
Mhm.
from work and hobbies and achievements and stories and efficiency and our spouse and pleasure and all these things that can take the place of what should be our North Star. And the thing is, if we know what our North Star is, we know why we do what we do, why we
Yes.
create like we create, why we chase the stories we chase and read the stories and movies we watch. It all ties to this thing that's the most important thing in our life. And like the
Mhm.
movie City Slickers, that's a
Oh,
ways back. It's a great movie,
Great
right? And
one.
Hurley, in that movie, this kind of crusty old trailhand and
Mhm.
guide talks about how everybody has their one thing. You just have to find what it is, and the rest doesn't mean much at all. And while a lot of things can mean a lot in our life, his point was like we all have one thing that guides us. And as creatives, as storytellers, it's really important to know that because it will play out in our life and then it will play out in our story as well that we write.
Absolutely. I love that, and the quote that you gave as well, because when you think about what is storytelling, you're going often on a journey, and that analogy of the traveler, the seafarers that are looking for which direction do we go. If we're out in the middle of the ocean and a storm comes,
Right.
suddenly we're disoriented, we don't know where we're going, and the best stories have storms. So
Totally.
conflict is coming, or you don't generally have a story. And so where do these people out on this boat look to even know where to go next? And so that picture is just beautiful of the North Star. I mean, just that fact of our universe, that we have a star, we're positioned on this earth in such a way that we can look up at a single star that won't move in the sky, is just an incredible thing, isn't it? It's just
It
pretty
really
cool.
it really is, and it helps us take away some of the chaos and the clutter from everything that's pulling at us. And with social media, with AI, with technology, it's easy to get lost not looking up at our North Star, but looking right at our screen in our palm. And when we do that, we don't tend to then orient ourselves to what's around us. I mean, think of all the restaurant times you've been eating and you just see people, they're
Yeah.
missing everything going on around them because they're staring into the screen and they're walking and they're driving and they're still doing the same thing. Like they're missing life because they're stuck in the artificial. So part of the North Star in the book is how do we go toward what's more real in our life, in our
Mhm.
creativity, and avoid and defy the artificial. And one of the beginning points in the book is, well, first start with your North Star because you
Mhm.
need to be anchored to something that matters most. And without that, you'll be distracted by everything that comes along.
And do you believe that the idea of searching for your North Star, I mean, is that kind of the tie-in between the real versus the artificial? Is we can certainly choose artificial stars, right? Like that is our choice. We can choose that star that's not standing still, but that's zigzagging all over the cosmos and go, oh, I'm going to follow that. Um,
Right,
can you
right.
speak into that idea of just how important is it to anchor to something like the actual North Star, the true North Star, versus, well, what if I like this star? It's shiny, it looks good. I'm going to follow it, and it's kind of fun zigzagging around. And maybe
Right,
that's the delusion, right?
right. And what you've described is how most people live their life is chasing the bright, shiny, and this zigzagging around. And the way we can tell is honestly to start saying it's not what should matter most, because we all know what we should say to questions like this, but where do we turn to for validation or significance? And
Mm,
so in the book, I
mhm.
have people just name out of this list I give their top five and then narrow it down to one if we can, because the goal is to see what is it that your life is orbiting around. And when you find that out, you see really quickly if it's the real or the artificial. And the true constant in our life, really the only thing that's a true constant, I would say, is God. And
Mm,
so when we anchor to God, we are anchoring not just to the most real being or the most real entity, but we're anchoring ourselves to the one who created the stars and who created reality. So it's more than a literal North Star. I'm saying what we need to anchor ourselves to is the one who created all of the stars. And when we do that, our life has a stability and a calm and a promise over it that allows us to unite not just with a distant God, but a God who says, I'm a creator and I want you to co create with me. And that's why I love, like, when you and I have these conversations,
Mhm.
it's not a religious conversation. It's not a church conversation at all. What it is it's saying we need to tap into the greatest reality of all so we can be the truest in our storytelling. To be a co-creator with God, we can create stories the world has never seen because what's mind blowing to a lot of people is the greatest sci-fi stories. Think of your favorite movies, favorite fantasy
Mhm.
novels, sci-fi. When you consider all of those and go, but even the best pale in comparison to the story that God has created, and we don't often think about it in terms of the wildness of fallen beings, of the unseen realm, of what happened in Eden, of giants roaming the earth, of Nephilim. Like the stories that God tells us and reveals, pulls the curtain back on, are really more mythic and more amazing than any novel we'd pick up, any novel that we could write. And so that helps us then go, okay, now that I'm focusing on what's real and I'm
Mhm.
focusing on that North Star in my life, now I can co-create from that place, not of just being distracted by the bright, shiny subpar stories, but I can create with the creator worlds and ideas and characters that are based in something deeper because I've gone deeper. I've anchored myself to something truer and deeper than how most people create. So it's kind of a full circle. You start with there's a larger story. How do you
Mhm.
anchor that story by going toward the real and away from the artificial? And then it affects not just the life you're living, but the creations that pour out of you.
And I love how in this book you bring up pretty early on some of the different sci-fi books, movies that are out there and point at some of the greater themes that they have going on that really do. And some of these are not necessarily God focused people. So Aldous Huxley, for example, who wrote Brave New World, is atheist, and when he was writing this book, he was coming at it from that perspective, as if there is no God, and yet he had such a caution. And I find that to be a very interesting dichotomy of someone saying, okay, I don't believe there is a God. Okay, you have the right to say that. Absolutely. You can believe that. There's free will for all of us to decide what to believe. But
Yes.
he also looked at society and said, I'm worried that we're headed this direction. And you put it really beautifully in the book of he's looking at it like we're headed toward a type of society that's very focused on pleasure, and it's essentially going to wear us down to the point where we are so easily corruptible basically because of that. And then switching to the other side of George Orwell, who wrote 1984, and his picture was we are going to be, the big brother. For those who've not read 1984, we are looking at it from another angle of essentially pain is going to be the thing that breaks us down and causes us to become this very corrupt future society. So two very different people with two very different worldviews, coming to conclusions that ultimately we're seeing society head towards certain things that don't look good. One of them thinks it's our tendency to focus on pleasure and all the things that essentially, I think there was a book you quote in there that's like, oh, what's the title? It's a great title. I'm going to have to peek in there, but it's the idea of like, essentially we're wearing ourselves out with just pleasurable things. And you might know the book I'm talking about.
Well,
Oh,
gosh, go ahead. Were you about to?
and then the idea that like the pain that we deal with is going to be the thing that causes us as a society. So as you're looking at those things coming from the North Star perspective of we have God as our North Star,
Right.
what types of commentaries do you have as you look at those different dichotomies?
Yeah, well, so
Love
when I was
that.
researching the book and writing it, it was so fascinating to dive into, as you're saying, 1984 and Brave New
Mhm,
World, because
mhm.
both of those were such brilliant works of art and story, but they also went very different ways with an imagined future. Like you said, one
Yes,
saw
yeah,
everything is controlled by inflicting pain. The other, everything and everyone is controlled by just infusing pleasure into everything. And I
mhm,
think right now, you look at our culture and you'd have to say we are like Rome, a pleasure-driven society. We want what we want. We want to define reality how we want to, create our
mm,
own reality for our own lives, not just the stories we're writing, but we want to say who we are and what our world is. And however we feel, we want everybody else then to say that's okay, that's your world. You've created it. So we're creating these micro worlds, every single person. And it's obviously not a sustainable way to live because everybody doesn't get to create their own reality if there's one
mhm.
true reality. And so we get to live in God's reality and we get to co-create with him in that reality, but he never gives us the option of creating an alternative reality that's just of our own design and pleasure. So 1984 and Brave New World kind of collide on that.
Yeah.
Another book written around that time, but actually a little earlier, was C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength. And that
Yes. Wondering if we could go there next, so you went there. Yes.
the three to me stand out as very
Mhm,
interesting studies from a sci-fi fantasy perspective of what we're talking about. Because Brave New World ultimately is a hopeless world that shows that ultimate pleasure ultimately leads to numbing and chaos and shutting down.
mhm,
And inflicting pain, same thing, right? Like a hopeless, dire world. But C.S. Lewis takes a little bit of a different approach in his book, That Hideous Strength, which takes place in the UK at a university setting, and it's the
mhm.
third in a trilogy, right? But it's
Yes.
really fascinating how he goes into what happens when humans try to remake reality according to their own vision. Like they decreate what God's created and try to recreate then something different. And so it's a wild story, and it would take the whole podcast to even go into a
Sure.
lot of what he does there.
Yeah.
But what I love is George Orwell, who wrote 1984, actually
Mhm,
did a review of C.S. Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength. And his critique or his main negative insight on it was, I would have liked this, except the supernatural, C.S. Lewis allowed the supernatural to keep breaking in to his story.
ah,
And C.S. Lewis responded to him and others at the time by saying, right, that's because the supernatural breaks through in our own lives, and you can't have life, even in story form, without supernatural. And Huxley and Orwell both had tried to largely take God out of their stories,
mhm,
and so it was a look at life in the future from a human perspective, not really
mhm,
from a God's worldview. And Lewis brings in the God worldview. And what I love about that is, as writers, I believe we need to do the same. We need to let the supernatural break into our stories
mhm,
because why? Because it breaks into our lives. We're living in a world with a seen and unseen realm, with a creator over it, with a wild beginning and a story where the impossible happens. Oceans part, mountains are moved, lions' mouths are shut, great beast in the sea and leviathans and the story of Job and Jonah and on and on. So that's the real challenge I think we have, is not to try to make a better story, we think, than we're living by taking God out of the story.
mm,
Because if we do that, then we at best have a human story that ultimately can't take us beyond the seen realm. And the unseen realm feels flat because if the unseen realm doesn't include anything greater than us, then we have not transcended the kind of stories God's invited us to tell. So that's just what I wanted to start with the North Star in the book on. The reason I feel like that's
mhm.
important.
So here is the quote. It's from Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. That's the title I was trying to think of, because it's a very poignant title. In 1984, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. So there is this essentially kind of a we're examining society without this North Star, and it looks bleak from both sides. So that's
Exactly.
kind of what you're pointing out. Yeah.
Exactly. No matter where we turn, I take in the book kind of a journey back to Eden and the tree of life and the tree of knowledge.
Hmm.
And the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the roots of that, I mean, it spreads wide underground, and many, many things tap in. But any story that taps into that at its core doesn't have God. And so any story without God will either lead to us seeking pleasure or us
Hmm.
seeking control. And so pain, pleasure, control, total freedom of any restraint, like we think those lead to life, but they never do. And so the North Star, that's why I say if it's anchored to God, to the most real, to the tree of life that it taps into, well, that allows us to tell the kind of stories then that feel the most true because they are. Because Bria, the thing is, like when we don't have our North Star as God, the most real being who created reality, well, then we untether ourselves from him. And as we do, no matter what else we attach ourselves to, like no matter what else our North Star is, it's never enough. And we become less real the more we move away from the most real. So the more we, the writers, the creators of story, move away from the most real, we actually become less real ourselves in the sense of the trueness of who we were created to be. And that's a terrible place to try to create a story from because now we're trying to create a world, but we are less authentic. We're less true as the world builder. And that will just ripple down into our characters, our plot, the story.
Yes, and one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that you walk the reader through, okay, so here's the North Star. Here are some of the things that are artificial. Here are some of the things that are real. I mean, you take us through all the way to practical ways to live out your authentic real life, if you will, to just sum that up. But it's not actually about me. And that's what's so cool about being a storyteller is that essentially if you're sitting down and saying, I want to tell this story, there almost always has to be an audience, right? It's not the and that not that the story can't be for me as well. I can be included in that audience.
Yes.
Um, but it really does boil down to I'm telling this story because someone else needs it, or I just have this draw, but that's why there's a draw there because somebody else probably needs your story that you're telling. And to your point of coming from that inauthentic place, it's going to be very hard to write a story that rings true because that's what's great about fiction. Fiction might be the thing that is not a factual story of facts, but it can be a true story. It can be true to the character of people. It can be true to how things tend to play out if you go certain ways, just like 1984, just like Brave New World, just like That Hideous Strength. And so some of the best science fiction, I have to bring it to The Matrix because you bring it up. Some of the best science fiction points right at these things. I mean, sometimes laser focused point. The Matrix, I think your quote in here could have been possibly Morpheus
Right.
saying, "What is real?"
Right.
So let's
Right.
let's go there. Let's talk about okay.
Yeah.
Um, as these, so to for most people know what the Matrix is, and the Matrix is Neo getting this choice. He has a blue pill or a red pill. And Morpheus is the person in front of him saying, what is real? How do we define real? And Neo at this point has no idea what he's talking about. And
So
we, the audience, when we all first saw that scene, we weren't quite sure what he was talking about. Okay, real is electrical impulses in the brain, is what he starts with. But he honestly couldn't tell Neo. He had to show him. And I mean, that analogy of life is just, I just can't help myself. I go back to Jesus Christ. That's what he did. He couldn't tell us. He had to come down and show us. And so he came down and showed us
yeah.
what walking the path that he's asking us to walking in the Bible, what is that path and how do we do it? He didn't just tell us to do it. He showed us. So that's me, my personal relationship with Christ. How does that tie into people creating their stories with some of what you are sharing here?
Yeah, I love how you just put it, and that's so good. And the thing is, I think the reason that we are kindred spirits on this, and I hope a lot of the listeners will pick up on this, is because think of it this way: everybody listening, I'm assuming, loves story or is a storyteller or is a writer and trying or has been very successful at it. Well, if you go all the way back to the beginning, and I'm going to tie this to the Matrix, but if you go all the way back to the beginning, well, what was the first attack in Eden? Because we all love stories. So let's go to the beginning of the whole story, our story, creation story. And the attack was on God as storyteller. The
Mhm,
serpent came into the garden and basically said, the storyteller, Adam and Eve, is telling you a false story. I have another narrative that's reality. The tree he said don't go to, actually do eat from.
mhm,
And the ability for you isn't just to serve God or be a son and daughter of God, but to be your own gods, small g.
mm,
And so he gives them this counterfeit narrative. And that's to me the first sign of the artificial. And so the
mm,
artificial isn't tied just to an iPhone or AI or ChatGPT. In our world, all of the ways technology is expanding now, it
mhm,
goes all the way back to Eden. And the first counterfeit storyteller was the enemy, the serpent, and he was attacking God's story. So as we go to tell stories, we have to realize if we are trying to align with what's true and what's real in our own lives and as creatives, then we will be under attack as well because
mhm,
we're trying to tell a story that has roots in the tree of life, even though that's all underground. It may not play out in a literal way in the story at all, but underground, we're tapping into the deepest truths and realities of how the universe and the world was made to operate. When we think of subjects like love and death and sacrifice and
mhm,
all of the transformation, all of these things. So, like in the Matrix, I love how Neo is 100% sure the reality he's living in is the only reality up to a
mhm,
point. He's like,
mhm,
until he meets Morpheus and they're in that conversation and a little bit more time passes with the pills, he's 100% convinced his reality is the only reality. And
mhm,
so, one of the big things in this book that I try to do is help people see start with you. Don't start with your story that you're writing, start with the story
mhm,
you're living. And the reality that you have accepted, is that the truest reality, or has the artificial invaded your life in ways you don't even realize? And so I give tenets of the real in the book, 5 tenets, and 5 tenets of the artificial, because what I'm trying to do is wake people up, just like Neo was woken up, or just like if you look at stories, gosh, like um, the Truman Show, right? In the Truman Show, he's convinced everything around him is real, happening just like it's supposed to. But Jim Carrey in that movie eventually starts to realize everything I think is real is artificial, and even the sky, even the people closest to me are just reading from scripts, right? There's hidden cameras everywhere. So those are just analogies to a greater battle that's going on between the real and the artificial. And when we start to know the tenets of the artificial, as writers, it allows us to tap into a deeper story that we can co-create with God, because all of a sudden we're not looking to formula. We're not looking to other people's writings to be our inspiration alone. we're going, the creator of the universe can actually help us tell the kind of stories that have never been told before if we will see the unseen, if we will step into that God and take the right pill from the matrix so that our
Mm,
eyes opened. And then imagine the kind of stories Neo could tell if he were a writer, okay, in the
mhm,
matrix, if that was his career, was a novelist. Well, which stories do we think would be better? The stories he was telling sitting in his cubicle at the beginning,
mhm,
or the
mm,
stories once his eyes were opened, even if it had nothing to do with the Matrix, the stories he was telling, which stories would be better? Well,
yeah.
100%, right? It would be after his eyes were opened. And so that's what we're trying to do here today with people, is to say, it may sound like it's better just to have tips and techniques on how to write a better paragraph, or how
Mhm.
many words you should write a day with your daily word count. But the best thing you can do is awaken to who God created you to be as a storyteller, and then start pursuing story that way, and casting away all of these artificial constraints that have been attacking God as storyteller and you as a storyteller your whole life.
And I do love that you brought it back to Genesis, because that, I mean, people of all walks of life consider Genesis a type of masterpiece, even if they don't believe it's a true story. And the formatting of how that is told is starts with a paradise, and then we go into the villain enters the story and disrupts with his lies. And so you think about some of the classic stories that are told, that is a very classic storytelling uh, plot that you can write. And so sometimes I think, gosh, it sounds so simplistic to say it this way, but man, we can model off of what God has done in telling us a story like that. If I'm stuck and I'm sitting here, I don't know what to write, I don't know how to write, what a great possible starting point. If you're thinking, I think I have a story here, I don't know how to start it, you can start with, how are things that are, the status quo. In the garden, it was a perfect place, and then things were going to go wrong. In the Matrix, it was this guy in a cubicle who may or may not have been happy with his life, but he was kind of just living his life, and then he's disrupted by Morpheus coming into his life. So you can take these incredible pictures that God gives us, and turn it into, how can I tell a story like that? Or, so
Right.
the idea of imitation, and essentially that is what we're doing. We're taking an imitation of real life and putting it on the page, or we're putting it on a canvas, or sculpting it. And that's what creatives do, or making a musical masterpiece. It can apply to any kind of creativity. And I wanted to, before we finish up here, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the lies of the artificial, because
Yeah.
I really appreciate what you're pointing out here. So do you mind if I read that list from the book?
That's great. Yeah, please do.
Okay. So you call it the five lies of the artificial. Number one, the artificial is real. So that is the idea that you look at something and you say, oh, yeah, that thing is real. So an extreme example would be, I'm putting on virtual reality headset, and I look into my headset and I see a woman standing in front of me, and she's got $1,000 in her hands. And if I were to reach out and grab that, is that real or is that not real? Well, it's not real. But
Right.
because you can see it, you might be deceived into thinking, "Oh, I'm about to collect $1,000 from this person." So that it seems so simple to say it, but it really is important to point that out. Okay, we're talking about what is artificial, what is real. They're two very different things. They're opposites. Number two, the machine is neutral. This is one of the reasons I'm a sci-fi writer, because I have never bought into that lie. And I know a lot of sci-fi writers do not buy into that lie, because they go, well, hold on. Who made the machine? Why did they make it? Who
Right.
programmed the software that is outputting the algorithm? Like, all those things, you could say software is neutral, or the gun is neutral, or like, it doesn't have a will, it doesn't have sentience. I think we can all, for the most part, agree on that. But neutral, I love the way you word that, because neutral is this it there's more behind. Otherwise, why are we creating more technology? What's the purpose of it? Um, if you're no, line number three, if you're concerned, you're the problem. I could go on about that one. Line number four, progress is always good. I think a lot of people can recognize that one, but I don't know. I feel like that one's a little more obvious one. The artificial is the future. Get used to it. So, any just commentary that you would add while we're finishing up here, going from the lies that come from the artificial, and maybe even how you came up with some of those, and then moving it away from that toward what you lead us to in the book.
Right. I would just add, Bria, that I think our culture, especially artists and creatives, have had an infatuation with the artificial, and we love stories so much and we get pulled into it so much that we start to be more enamored by it than we do reality.
Mhm.
We think it's more exciting. We think it's there's more possibility. We think, that we are more the more we enter into these artificial worlds. I was checking out a grocery store just last night, and the guy behind me was talking to a friend that was there, and they had this I had a lot of groceries, so I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but they had this long conversation about this new game that you submerge yourself into with virtual reality,
Mhm.
and he was saying it's really hard to explain, but all I can tell you is it's better than real life in every way, and
Mm.
that really,
Oh, wow.
because this is a guy who's probably he looked to be about 28, 29, and
Mhm.
so this isn't a guy who the best days of his life have passed. Like, he's a young man, and the
Mhm.
young woman he's talking to, like, when we start to think the artificial is more true or exciting or real than what God is inviting us into, I think something in us goes numb because
Mm.
we lose our awe of God and the awe of the world around us. And so our stories start to become more formulaic because we're just trying to create things in our own strength that sound fascinating, but like Brave New World and like 1984, no matter what path they go down, it always dead ends because we're not a big enough creator to think of something better than God has tapped into. And with Him, there are infinite stories, infinite possibilities. With us, we tend to have limited formulaic type stories because we look at what's been done and try to do something similar.
Mm.
So, yeah, the artificial, we need to lose our love affair with, like, we're more excited by the new iPhone oftentimes than we are to try to dive into something with God. And you think, wait a minute, you'd rather look at a new iPhone than spend time with the creator of oceans? Like,
Mm.
something's off with that. Something's, but it's
Mm.
how culture has shaped us. And so we have to break free from the matrix.
And one last thing I'll mention that you talk about in the book is also how isolating it can be, and to think, I want to go isolate myself with this artificial thing, whatever it is, what that does to human beings. I mean, psychologists already know there's tons of research on what happens to people who are isolated and who don't get human interaction. And most of us have probably seen Castaway. He starts talking to a volleyball. And
Right?
I mean, right? So that's just one picture of, he was so desperate for community that he made a volleyball his community because he had no option. It wasn't because he chose that. He was lost at sea. But that we would actually choose to sit with our iPhone instead of our spouse or our son or daughter or our mother or father or our friends or our community. That is very telling of our times. And I think you've really hit on something that's so important for creatives. I would say anyone who has any interest in creating anything could pick up this book and benefit from learning how to differentiate some of these things and also how to move forward. And I so appreciate, it's been very helpful for me in my journey as a creative as well. So I just want to thank you for writing this book just personally for me as a
Well,
reader.
you're welcome. And the book, like we've talked a little today about the real and the artificial. The book is called Risk the Real because the whole last section is on risk and how do you risk well for what matters most.
Yes.
And the reason that's important, and I just would leave, I guess, the listener with this is if we don't understand risk, then we will play it safe. We will live a small story. The stories we write will take less risk because we'll start listening to people that say, this is the hot trend, just write more of this. Or, no, 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 your novel can't have the supernatural breaking in. And like C.S. Lewis will go, well, okay, we need to, we want success. So we're going to pull back the risk factor and just do what we're told or follow the formula. And so
Mm,
part of the book goes into if we're co-creating with God, then we can risk well for what matters most. And so there's 5 tenets of risk that I think will help storytellers because all of a sudden you can ask yourself, as a writer, I'm risking a lot of time creating this 80,000, 100,000 word novel. I'm risking money to make it come to life. But am I risking well or am I risking in a way that goes more toward the artificial? In terms of how I'm creating. So the last part of the book, after the real and the artificial, is risk. And I think any storyteller is by nature a risk taker because they're creating something that's never been and sharing it with the world. That's risky.
mm.
But there are better ways to risk and worse ways to risk. And so the book goes into that as a culmination. And I think writers and lovers of story will find that really helpful.
Absolutely. Well, Alan, I just wanted to thank you again for coming on to Joy on Paper Live. This has been such a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you about Risk the Real. And we certainly will welcome you back in the future when you've got your next book coming out. And for the listeners, those watching, you can see Alan's website right there, withallen.com. Is there anywhere else they can follow you, social media, or any place else they can connect with you?
The best place is the website. They can sign up there for free daily readings about story and creativity. And if they just go to withallen.com/sign-up, it's free daily readings of a couple of paragraphs. But yeah, it's a great way to stay in touch. And if they respond to those daily readings, it'll come straight to me. So that's a way I can stay in touch with writers and creatives and just cheer them on.
Wonderful. And I want to mention one last thing. Coming up this month, you will be doing Realm Makers workshops. So at Realm Makers Writers Conference, it's a
Yes.
science fiction fantasy conference specifically for authors who are Christians. Alan will be there for anybody looking for a writers conference. I imagine there might still be room to sign up. I'm not positive
Yeah.
about that, but if you
Well,
look up Realm Makers,
yeah.
um, that is an incredible writers conference.
And if people
And
can't be there in person, there's an
yeah,
online option. So they can even watch it from their home if they'd like to.
yes, there's a virtual option if you can't travel to St. Louis where the conference takes place. And you get all the benefits where you get to watch all the workshops. And I have sat through some of your workshops at past conferences, and they're just incredible. So, again, thank you for coming on, and we'll look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you, Ria. Have a great day.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.